The city was alive in the early morning, with streams of people rushing to offices, the sound of car horns echoing between tall glass towers, and the smell of roasted coffee drifting from the small shops that dotted the streets. In one of those shops, a small cafe tucked neatly at the corner of a busy avenue, life moved at a slower pace. The cafe wasn't fancy, but it was warm and inviting. The smell of fresh pastries filled the air, and the hum of a coffee machine was steady and comforting. The glass door opened, and a man in plain clothes walked in. He wore a simple dark jacket, ordinary sneakers, and a cap pulled low over his forehead. Nobody paid him much attention. To everyone, he looked like just another customer stopping for a coffee before heading to work. But beneath the ordinary clothes and calm face was a man whose name carried weight in the world of business. He was a billionaire, a CEO who owned companies spread across industries. His decisions affected thousands of employees. His signature could shift markets, and his words in meetings were enough to change the direction of powerful firms. But at that moment, none of that mattered. He didn't want to be seen as a CEO or as someone important. He just wanted to blend in, drink a coffee, and gather his thoughts before the biggest deal of his career. The deal he was about to sign later that day was worth $200 million. Everyone on his team had spent months preparing for it. Analysts, lawyers, advisors, an army of people had worked to build it. The numbers looked right, the presentations were polished, and his board was expecting him to seal it with his signature. On the outside, it looked like a shining success waiting to happen. Inside, however, he felt the weight of it. He wasn't a man who doubted himself often, but he had lived long enough to know that sometimes the brightest packages hide the darkest risks. That quiet doubt followed him like a shadow as he stepped into the cafe and stood in line. The cafe wasn't crowded yet, but there was a steady flow of customers. Behind the counter, a young cashier was trying to keep up. She looked fresh out of training, glancing nervously at the screen as she pressed buttons, fumbling with the register every now and then. Her apron was a little too big and her name tag slightly crooked, but she smiled at everyone despite her nerves. She was new and it was obvious, but she was trying her best. The barista beside her, more experienced, handled drinks with smooth confidence, calling out orders without missing a beat. The contrast between the two was clear, but the young cashier's effort shone through her clumsy movements. When it was the billionaire's turn, he stepped forward casually, giving a polite smile. "Medium coffee, black," he said in a low, even tone. He noticed her fingers hover uncertainly over the register, searching for the right button. She pressed one, then another, then quickly corrected herself. He could see her cheeks turning pink as if embarrassed to make mistakes in front of a stranger. He simply waited, not in a hurry, though he had 100 reasons to be. "That'll be $3, she said, her voice steady but soft, like she was still finding her rhythm. He pulled out a few bills, handed them over, and took the receipt. He stepped aside to wait for his coffee, standing near the counter. The chatter of other customers filled the space, but his mind wandered. He thought of the meeting later, the pressure of investors waiting for results, and the carefully written speech he was supposed to give when the deal was signed. He had given many speeches before, but this one felt different. It felt like standing on the edge of something that could either lift him higher than ever or drag him down if it went wrong. As he waited, he noticed a deck of cards sitting in his pocket. He carried them often, not because he was a magician, but because he enjoyed small tricks. It was a hobby he had picked up years ago during long flights and lonely hotel nights. It helped him relax, took his mind off the noise of business, and gave him something simple to focus on. Without thinking much, he pulled the cards out and began shuffling them quietly, his hands moving with practiced ease. The young cashier noticed. She glanced at him as she wiped the counter, curious. Few people played with cards in line at a cafe, especially so early in the day. He caught her glance and gave a small smile, then flicked a card into his palm and made it disappear with a subtle move. It wasn't perfect, but it was smooth enough to draw a small laugh from a child standing nearby with his mother. The billionaire enjoyed that reaction. He had learned long ago that even in the serious world of money and power, small joys like this mattered. He decided to try another trick, a simple one where he would ask someone to pick a card, shuffle the deck, and then reveal it. Since the cafe was not too busy, and people were standing around waiting for their drinks, he turned slightly toward the young cashier and held out the cards. "Want to try one?" he asked casually, his voice kind. She blinked, a little surprised, then glanced around as if to check whether he was serious. "Me?" she asked. "Why not?" he said, offering the deck. She hesitated, then pulled one card out. He nodded, motioning for her to look at it but not show him. She did as told, her lips pressing into a smile as she tried to hide it. He shuffled the deck, his hands moving quickly, but in his slight rush he made a mistake. The card she had chosen became visible at the wrong time. To most people it would have been a small slip, easy to miss. But not to her. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing just a little, then spoke words that hung in the air longer than she realized. "That's the wrong trick," she said, her voice clear and certain. "You shuffled it wrong. Everyone can see the card already." The billionaire paused, the deck still in his hand. For a moment he just stared at her, caught between surprise and amusement. Around them a few customers chuckled softly, not at him but at the unexpected honesty of the cashier's words. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. Her tone carried no mockery, only a plain truth stated without hesitation. He looked at her, then laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that comes when someone cuts through a mask and speaks straight. "You're right," he admitted, slipping the card back into the deck. "I did mess that one up." She shrugged lightly, her smile shy but genuine. "My dad used to do that trick," she said softly. "I know when it's done right and when it's not." He felt a flicker of curiosity. Her words were simple, but they carried weight, like an echo of something larger. He nodded, slipping the cards back into his pocket as his coffee order was called. Picking it up, he glanced at her one last time before leaving, the phrase still fresh in his mind. "That's the wrong trick." He stepped back out into the busy street, the cold air brushing against his face. But those words stayed with him longer than the taste of the coffee or the noise of traffic. At first, it was nothing more than an observation about a card trick gone wrong. But as he walked, something about it stirred deeper thoughts. He had been preparing to sign a deal worth $200 million, a deal polished to look perfect, yet built on layers of numbers and strategies that only a handful of people truly understood. What if, beneath it all, it was also the wrong trick? As he walked toward his office, blending into the crowd of suits and hurried faces, he couldn't shake the memory of the young cashier's bold honesty. It was such a small moment in such an ordinary place, but it felt like the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. A seed had been planted in his mind, and by the time he reached his office doors, the weight of it had already begun to grow. The morning crowd outside grew heavier, but inside the billionaire's mind there was silence, broken only by the words that had been spoken so simply. "That's the wrong trick." He carried them with him like an invisible weight, though no one else around him would have guessed it. To anyone passing by, he was just another man walking toward his office, holding a cup of coffee. But deep inside, his thoughts were far from ordinary. He had learned in life that truth often slipped out when least expected, and sometimes from the mouths of people who had no idea how much their words could mean. When he reached his office tower, the guards nodded respectfully as he entered. He passed through the tall glass doors into the polished lobby that smelled faintly of leather and fresh flowers. The building was one of many he owned, and yet it felt heavy that morning, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. He rode the elevator up to the top floor, listening to the familiar hum as the numbers blinked upward. His reflection in the mirrored wall stared back at him, casual clothes, tired eyes, and a mind that refused to stay quiet. The deal was set to be signed that afternoon. His advisors would arrive within the hour to go over last-minute details. Investors were expecting celebrations, the media was waiting for headlines, and every person in his circle believed this was a victory. He knew what they wanted from him. A signature, a smile, a statement about growth and the future. But the words of a young cashier were still tangled in his thoughts. That's the wrong trick. It wasn't about the cards anymore. It was about the illusion of control, the way numbers could be shuffled to look impressive but hide the truth beneath. He set his coffee on the desk and sat in his chair, staring out over the city skyline. The streets below looked small, like lines on a map, cars moving like toys. From that height, the city looked simple, even predictable, but he knew better. He had built his empire on reading the unseen, on knowing when something looked too smooth to be real. And now, with $200 million on the line, he couldn't ignore the faint voice inside him that whispered doubt. The first knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant entered, holding a stack of papers. "The team is on their way up," she said softly. "They'll want to run through the numbers again before the final signing." He nodded, taking the papers but not opening them. His eyes lingered on the desk, the smooth surface reflecting the light from above. He thanked her, and when she left, he leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingers together. He thought of the cashier again, her honest tone, her unshaken voice. She hadn't been trying to teach him anything, but her words had cut deeper than any advisor's warning, because they were simple, clear, free of polish. Minutes later, the conference room filled. His senior managers, financial officers, and lawyers all took their seats. Laptops opened, charts lit up on the screen, and numbers spilled out into the room. They spoke with confidence, pointing to profits, projections, and graphs that soared upward like arrows to the sky. The CEO listened, nodding occasionally, but his mind was restless. Every slide looked perfect, almost too perfect. He thought of the card trick again, of how one wrong shuffle had revealed what was meant to be hidden. Was this deal any different? When the head of finance finished speaking, the room grew quiet, waiting for his response. He tapped his pen against the table slowly, his gaze moving from one face to another. All of them believed. All of them trusted the numbers on the screen. All of them wanted him to say yes. "It's a strong deal," one of the advisors said quickly. "There's really no risk in moving forward now." The CEO leaned forward, folding his hands. "There's always risk," he said quietly. His voice carried calm authority, but those who knew him best could hear the hesitation in his tone. "Tell me again about the long-term debt hidden in their balance sheets." The advisor shifted in his seat. "We've already accounted for that. It looks worse than it is." "Worse than it is," the CEO repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Or worse than you're showing me." The room went still. It wasn't the first time he had questioned his own team, but today the doubt cut sharper. He thought of the cashier pointing out his mistake with the cards. He thought of her saying, "Everyone can see it already." What if the truth of this deal was also visible if only he chose to look hard enough? Silence stretched before someone cleared their throat and tried to speak, but he raised a hand to stop them. He stood walking slowly toward the screen, eyes scanning the neat columns of numbers. They were impressive, yes, but he knew that numbers could be dressed up just like tricks. If you shuffled them enough, people stopped asking what they really meant. He turned back to the table. "I want a deeper breakdown," he said firmly. "Not the polished version. Show me the raw data. Show me everything that doesn't fit into these perfect graphs." The advisors exchanged uneasy glances. They had thought the meeting would be smooth, a celebration leading to the signing. Instead, it had turned into another round of scrutiny. The CEO could sense their discomfort, but he didn't care. He had built his life by questioning what others overlooked. If he was wrong, so be it. But if he was right, then a mistake this size could cost him far more than money. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind, alone in the quiet room. He poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, staring out at the city again. His reflection looked back at him, faint in the glass. He remembered the cashier's face, the way she had spoken without fear, without hesitation. It was rare to meet someone who didn't soften the truth, who didn't try to impress or flatter. She had seen a mistake and said it plain. He found himself wondering about her. Who was she outside that cafe? What made her speak so directly? Was it simply her nature, or had life taught her to be that way? He didn't know, but the honesty of her words was something he respected deeply. In a world where everyone measured their sentences, where people spoke in layers to protect themselves, her simple truth had been refreshing. And maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what he needed to hear before the deal of his life. Later that afternoon, when the official meeting for the signing drew closer, the CEO walked into the boardroom with a different energy. He wasn't nervous, but he wasn't eager either. He was alert, watchful. His team had prepared the documents. The lawyers had placed the contracts neatly on the table, and the other company's representatives were waiting with smiles that seemed a little too polished. Cameras weren't in the room yet, but reporters were waiting just outside. It was all set. He sat at the head of the table, the pen placed before him. The air was thick with expectation. He looked at the papers, then at the faces around him. For a long moment, he didn't move. He thought of the deck of cards, of the slip that had revealed what was meant to be hidden. He thought of the young cashier, her steady voice cutting through the air. "That's the wrong trick." He picked up the pen, turning it slowly in his hand. Then he placed it back down. His decision was not yet made. He wasn't going to sign just because everyone else believed in the trick. He would look deeper. He owed himself, his company, and every person who trusted him more than blind faith. As the others shifted uncomfortably, waiting for him to act, he leaned back in his chair, calm but firm. "Before we sign," he said, "we need to talk." The room grew tense. It wasn't what anyone had expected, but the CEO had made up his mind. He wouldn't move forward until he knew the truth. And somewhere in the back of his thoughts, the image of the cafe, the sound of the young cashier's voice, stayed with him like a guiding light, reminding him to see through illusions, no matter how convincing they seemed. The silence in the boardroom stretched longer than anyone expected. Men and women in tailored suits shifted in their chairs, their polished shoes tapping against the floor in quiet rhythm. Laptops hummed faintly, papers rustled, but all eyes were fixed on the man at the head of the table. The CEO sat still, his fingers resting lightly on the pen in front of him, his gaze far away as if he were seeing something beyond the walls of that sleek room. No one dared to interrupt. They knew him well enough to understand that when he fell into silence, something important was forming in his mind. Finally, he looked up, his eyes sharper than before. "We've been rushing," he said slowly. "This deal is polished, yes, but I'm not convinced it's clean." His words fell heavy. One of his lawyers leaned forward nervously. "Sir, everything has been reviewed. This is one of the most airtight agreements we've ever drafted." The CEO gave a small nod. "Airtight on paper, maybe. But papers don't always show the full truth. I want answers that aren't rehearsed." He pushed the contract slightly away from him. His team exchanged uncertain looks. Across the table, the representatives from the other company tried to mask their unease with smiles. But beneath those smiles, the CEO saw the flicker of discomfort. He had spent his life reading faces, knowing when someone was hiding a truth, and right now those faces told him enough. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "I want to know what's hidden in this deal, and I'll keep asking until I find it." The room was heavy with tension. Cameras outside were waiting for news of a signed contract, but inside, nothing was moving forward. His words had frozen the moment. His own executives began to fidget, whispering softly among themselves. They had believed the deal was already done, but now he was peeling back the cover. One of the younger analysts finally spoke hesitantly. "There are some projections that didn't fully align with the rest, but we assumed the risks were minor, given the scale of the acquisition." The CEO's eyes locked onto the analyst. "Assumed? Or ignored?" The analyst swallowed hard. "We believed the numbers balanced in the long run." The CEO tapped his fingers against the table. "Belief isn't enough when $200 million are at stake. Show me the projections. All of them. Even the ones you left out of the presentation." The team scrambled, opening files, clicking through spreadsheets, pulling up charts that hadn't been prepared for display. And as the hidden numbers appeared, the story changed. The bright future promised on glossy slides dulled into something uncertain. Debt ratios looked higher. Market risks that had been described as manageable suddenly loomed larger. The smiles on the faces of the other company's representatives faltered as the reality unfolded on the screen. The CEO sat quietly, watching, listening, absorbing every detail. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves now, and in his mind the words of the cashier echoed once more. "That's the wrong trick." He felt a strange clarity, as if that single phrase had sharpened his vision. What everyone else had been dazzled by, he now saw plainly. When the room finally went still again, he spoke softly. "You wanted me to sign this without looking deeper. But this isn't growth. This is a trap," no one answered. The weight of his words pressed down like stone. Even his own executives had nothing to say. They had been caught in the illusion, and it was only his refusal to rush that had pulled them back. The CEO rose to his feet, his tall figure casting a shadow across the polished table. "This meeting is over. We won't be signing today." The opposing team began to protest, but his voice cut through firmly, leaving no space for negotiation. "If this is the best you have to offer, then there is no deal." He turned and walked out, leaving the stunned room behind. His steps were steady, but inside he felt the rush of adrenaline. He had just stepped away from what everyone believed was a monumental success. To the outside world, it might look like hesitation or even failure. But he knew better. He trusted his instincts, and they told him this deal was poison wrapped in gold. Back in his office, he closed the door and exhaled slowly. For the first time all day, he felt the tightness in his chest ease. He thought again of the cafe, the small space filled with the smell of coffee and pastries, the young cashier who had unknowingly shifted the course of his decision. It amazed him how life worked, how the most powerful lessons didn't always come from boardrooms, advisors, or high-paid consultants. Sometimes they came from ordinary people, in ordinary places, speaking ordinary words that carried extraordinary meaning. He sat down at his desk and poured himself another glass of water. His phone buzzed with messages, questions from reporters, demands from investors, alerts from staff. Everyone wanted to know why he hadn't signed, but he ignored them for the moment. Instead, he pulled out the deck of cards from his pocket and shuffled them slowly, carefully this time, making sure not to repeat the mistake. The cards whispered against each other, a soothing sound. He thought of how easily people were fooled by tricks, how quickly they believed in what looked smooth and flawless. But the truth was always there for those willing to look close enough. He picked a card, set it aside, and smiled faintly to himself. The trick only worked when it was done honestly. And maybe he thought business wasn't so different. The rest of the day moved quickly. Calls poured in from board members, some angry, some worried, others relieved. A few praised his caution, others questioned his hesitation. He listened to them all, but his decision stood firm. He knew what he had seen in that meeting, and no amount of pressure would make him sign a deal that felt wrong. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and the city lights began to glow, the CEO made a quiet decision. Tomorrow he would return to the cafe. He didn't know exactly why, but something in him wanted to see the young cashier again. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe curiosity, or maybe he just wanted to remind himself that sometimes the clearest truths came from the simplest voices. As he left his office, the city felt different. The weight on his shoulders was lighter, though the road ahead was uncertain. He had turned away from a $200 million deal, but he had done so with his integrity intact. That mattered more to him than any number on paper. He walked down the busy avenue, blending once again with the crowd. The sounds of the city wrapped around him, horns, footsteps, voices, laughter, and somewhere in the distance he caught the faint smell of roasted coffee drifting through the air. It made him smile because it reminded him of the place where truth had spoken when he least expected it. The night was cool, the sky dotted with stars above the tall towers. As he walked, he realized that life had just taught him something new. Tricks may fool the eyes, but truth always reveals itself in time. And sometimes it takes only one honest voice to show the difference. The next morning, the city woke up to news that the deal had not been signed. Financial papers questioned the sudden pause. Reporters filled their articles with speculation, and investors buzzed with curiosity. Some said the CEO was being too cautious, others praised him for being wise, but none of them knew what had really happened in that boardroom. None of them knew about the voice that had stayed with him since the morning before, the voice of a young cashier who had spoken the plainest of truths, without even knowing it. He arrived at his office early that day, long before the building filled with people. The air was quiet, the sun still climbing over the edge of the skyline. He walked through the empty halls thinking about what lay ahead. His team would be restless, investors would be calling for answers, and the other company would surely try again to push the deal forward. But his decision remained steady. He would not sign something that didn't feel right. Still, in the quiet of the morning, he thought of the cafe again. The warmth of the place, the smell of fresh coffee, and the cashier's steady eyes when she had said those words. He didn't know why, but he wanted to go back. Maybe it was gratitude, or maybe it was the need to remind himself that not all wisdom came from boardrooms and charts. Sometimes it came from a simple exchange with someone who wasn't trying to impress him. So before the rush of meetings began, he slipped out of his office and walked down the avenue to that little corner cafe. The shop was busier that morning than when he first visited. People in suits lined up for their coffee, while students tapped away on laptops at the small tables. The hum of conversation filled the room. He stepped inside quietly, again dressed simply, and joined the line. The same cashier was behind the counter, still a little nervous with the register but smiling warmly as she greeted each customer. She didn't notice him at first. To her, he was just another face in the morning crowd. When it was his turn, he stepped forward. "Medium coffee, black," he said, just as he had the day before. She looked up then and her eyes flickered with recognition. She gave a small smile, though she didn't say anything right away. She took his order, pressed the buttons more smoothly this time, and handed him the receipt. $3, she said. Her voice was a little stronger than before, her movements less clumsy. It seemed she was already settling into her role. He handed her the bills, then, after a pause, said quietly, "You were right yesterday." She blinked, confused. "About what?" "The trick," he said, smiling faintly. "I did it wrong, and I think I needed someone to point it out." Her cheeks turned slightly pink, and she gave a shy laugh. "I wasn't trying to be rude." "You weren't," he said. "You were honest. That's rare." She tilted her head, unsure of how to respond, and moved on to the next customer. He stepped aside to wait for his coffee, but he felt lighter somehow, as if simply telling her she had been right had lifted something off his shoulders. When his coffee was ready, he took it and found a seat by the window. For a few minutes he just sat there, watching the stream of people outside. He thought of how strange it was that someone so far removed from his world of business had unknowingly changed the way he saw things. It reminded him that life often placed lessons in unexpected places. The cafe grew busier, and the cashier hurried between customers, doing her best to keep up. He noticed how she handled mistakes now, less flustered, more steady, with small smiles that kept the line moving. She was learning quickly. Watching her, he thought about how much pressure she must be under, new to the job, trying to prove herself. In a way, it wasn't so different from the pressure he faced, though on a completely different scale. Pressure to do well, pressure not to fail, pressure to keep moving even when mistakes happened. He admired her effort. When the rush slowed, she glanced toward his table. Their eyes met briefly, and she walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. "I never got to ask," she said softly. "Did the trick work later?" He smiled. "It worked in a way you wouldn't expect." She raised an eyebrow. "How's that?" He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Let's just say it reminded me to look more closely at something important. And because of that, I avoided making a big mistake." Her expression turned curious, but she didn't press for details. She just nodded and said, "Sometimes it's the small things that matter." Her words struck him again, simple yet true. He found himself wondering how many times in his life he had overlooked the small voices, the little moments, because he was too focused on the grand stage of business. Perhaps he had forgotten that truth wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, spoken by someone who didn't even realize the weight of what they were saying. As he left the cafe, he felt a renewed sense of clarity. Back in his office, he faced the storm of calls, emails, and meetings. People wanted answers. Some demanded he reconsider the deal. Others pushed him to explain his hesitation. But he stood firm. He called his executives into the room again and laid it out plainly. "We will not move forward until every risk is uncovered. If that means walking away entirely, so be it." The days that followed were filled with scrutiny. The other company tried to sweeten the offer, adjusting terms, hiding their panic behind smiles. His own board members grew restless, urging him to reconsider. But he remembered the moment the trick had failed in his hands, and the way the cashier had spoken without fear. He would not be fooled by polished numbers or promises that sounded too perfect. One evening, after another long day of arguments and pressure, he sat alone in his office again. The city light sparkled outside, casting a glow across his desk. He pulled out the deck of cards once more, shuffling them slowly. He thought about how close he had come to signing away not just money, but trust. If he had gone through with the deal, it would have looked like success in the headlines. But in truth, it would have been a slow, unraveling disaster. His people would have suffered, jobs would have been lost, and his reputation would have been scarred, all because he believed in the wrong trick. And then he thought again of the cafe, of the cashier's steady eyes and simple words. A stranger who had nothing to gain from him had unknowingly reminded him of the value of honesty. In a world where everyone seemed to want something, her truth had been pure, untouched by agenda. He found himself deeply grateful for that. By the end of the week, the deal officially collapsed. Reporters wrote headlines filled with speculation, calling it shocking, surprising, even reckless. But the CEO didn't care. Behind closed doors, he had seen the truth. He knew he had saved his company from a trap. And, more importantly, He had been reminded that real wisdom didn't always come dressed in expensive suits or spoken in polished speeches. Sometimes it came from someone wearing an oversized apron, pressing the wrong buttons on a cash register, but speaking words that cut straight through illusion. That weekend, he returned once more to the cafe. This time he didn't sit quietly in the corner. He approached the counter after ordering his coffee and said with a gentle smile, "You know, you saved me from making a very big mistake." The cashier blinked, surprised. "Me, how?" He shook his head softly. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. But just know this, your honesty mattered more than you can imagine." She looked at him, unsure of what to say. Finally she smiled. "Well, I guess sometimes people need to hear the truth, even if it's small." He nodded. Especially then. As he left the cafe that day, he felt a quiet peace. The noise of the city surrounded him. The weight of business still pressed on his shoulders, but something inside had shifted. He had been reminded that even the smallest voices could carry the greatest truths, and no matter how powerful he became, he knew he would never forget the words spoken so simply. That's the wrong trick. The weeks rolled on, and the city slowly moved past the headlines of the failed deal. New stories took over the front pages. New rumors swirled in business circles, but the decision still lingered in quiet conversations. People speculated on what had really happened, some praising the CEO's caution while others whispered about missed opportunities. Yet inside the company there was a calm steadiness. The staff, who had once feared a risky change, now worked with a renewed sense of loyalty. They trusted that their leader was not chasing numbers at the cost of their future. For the CEO himself, life carried on, but with a subtle shift. He had always been a man driven by results, by achievements and victories. Yet now he found himself paying closer attention to smaller details, not just in business but in everyday life. He noticed things he once overlooked, the way his assistant carried the weight of too many late nights, the way young interns lit up when someone actually listened to their ideas, the way even the quietest staff member sometimes had the most important observation in a meeting. He began to realize that leadership wasn't only about grand strategies. It was about noticing, listening, and respecting the smallest truths. And still, his thoughts often drifted back to the cafe. He had gone back a few times, always quietly, never announcing who he was. Each time he ordered the same simple coffee and exchanged a few words with the cashier. She never treated him any differently. To her, he was just another customer, though one who seemed unusually kind and thoughtful. She had no idea the weight of the decisions he carried on his shoulders, or the fortune he controlled, and perhaps that was why he kept coming back. In a world where people often calculated what they could gain from him, here was someone who asked for nothing more than a $3 payment and a genuine smile. One morning, as he sat by the window sipping his coffee, he saw the cashier fumble again at the register. A customer grew impatient, tapping their foot loudly. She apologized quickly, her hands moving nervously over the buttons. The customer muttered something under their breath before snatching the receipt and walking away. He watched as the cashier's shoulders slumped slightly. She tried to hide it behind a polite smile, but he could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She reminded him of himself in those rare moments when he doubted his own decisions, when the noise of criticism almost drowned out his conviction. When the line thinned, he walked over to the counter. "You're doing better than you think," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised. "You saw that?" "I messed it up again," he shook his head. "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is how quickly you learn, and you've already come a long way." Her lips curved into a small smile, and she nodded. "Thanks. Some days it just feels like I'm not good enough." He wanted to tell her that she was more than good enough, that her simple honesty had once saved him from a decision that could have cost hundreds of millions. But he didn't. He kept that part of the story to himself. Some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. Instead, he simply said, "Keep going. You're stronger than you know." That day, he returned to his office with a new thought stirring in his mind. He had always believed that wisdom flowed downward, from the top of the mountain to those below. But maybe it wasn't like that at all. Maybe wisdom could rise upward too, from the quietest corners, from voices often ignored. Maybe true strength came from recognizing that. Months later, his company stood on the edge of another potential deal. This time, his team approached it with caution, carefully examining every detail. They remembered the lesson from the last time. and he reminded them often that nothing should be taken at face value. "The wrong trick can look convincing," he would say in meetings, "but we must always look deeper." His words became a kind of guiding principle for the company. It wasn't about fear. It was about respect for the truth. Meanwhile, the cashier continued to grow into her role at the cafe. She learned faster with each passing week, her hand steady, her smile brighter. Customers who once grew impatient now appreciated her warmth and effort. She never knew that she had played a part in shaping the course of a company worth billions. She never knew that her words had echoed in boardrooms and influenced decisions that affected thousands of lives. To her, it was just another day at work, another coffee poured, another receipt printed. But the CEO knew, and he carried that with him. One afternoon, he decided to do something he rarely did. He left his office early and walked to the cafe not for coffee, but simply to sit and watch the world move around him. When the cashier noticed him, she gave a wave. "Back again?" she said cheerfully. "Couldn't stay away," he replied. She laughed softly. "Well, I guess that means we're doing something right." He nodded, then after a pause added, "You know, you once told me something that stayed with me. Something simple, but it changed the way I saw things." Her brow furrowed slightly. "What did I say?" "You told me I was doing the wrong trick." She blushed a little, covering her face with her hand. "Oh no, you remember that? I was so embarrassed after I said it." He chuckled. "Don't be. You were right, and it was exactly what I needed to hear." She looked at him for a moment, her expression softening. "I didn't mean anything by it. I was just honest." "Exactly," he said. "And sometimes honesty is the rarest thing of all." For a moment, they stood there in the quiet hum of the cafe, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the murmur of conversations. It was a simple moment, unremarkable to anyone else, but to him it carried more weight than some of the grandest meetings of his life. In the months that followed, his company flourished, guided by caution, clarity, and a newfound respect for the smallest voices. He led with a steadier hand, not only because of his experience, but because he had been reminded of the value of humility. And though the world might never know the full story behind the deal that never was, he knew. He knew that it wasn't analysts, advisors, or investors who had stopped him from stepping into disaster. It was a cashier with trembling hands and an honest tongue. Years later, when people looked back on his career, they spoke of his wisdom, his foresight, his uncanny ability to avoid mistakes others would have made. They praised his instincts, his leadership. But the truth was simpler. He had just learned to listen. To listen even when the voice was small, even when the words were spoken in the middle of an ordinary day by someone who didn't know their own strength. And whenever he passed that cafe, he would smile to himself, remembering the words that had changed everything. "That's the wrong trick,"